Sun barely peeked over the horizon when Jake Miller packed his duffel bag for what he thought would be the last time at Fort Braxton Sniper Academy. His hands shook as he folded his uniform, the same uniform that had brought him so much shame over the past 8 weeks. Tomorrow morning at 6:30 a.m., he would be officially expelled from the most elite sniper training program in the country. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Jake had dreamed of this moment since he was 12 years old, watching his older brother Marcus come home from his first deployment as a Marine sniper. The stories Marcus told about precision, patience, and the honor of serving as the eyes and guardian angel for his fellow soldiers had filled Jake's young mind with purpose. But now at 22, those dreams were crumbling like sand through his fingers. The problem wasn't Jake's dedication or his physical fitness. He could run 5 miles without breaking a sweat, do more push-ups than most of his classmates, and had scored perfectly on every written exam about ballistics, wind calculation, and tactical theory. The problem was simple and devastating. Jake couldn't hit his targets when it mattered most. During practice sessions, when the pressure was low and instructors weren't watching closely, Jake could place shots within the bullseye consistently. His natural hand-eye coordination was actually above average, and his understanding of mathematics helped him calculate distances and wind drift better than most recruits. But the moment an evaluation began, the moment Sergeant First Class Wilson started timing him or other students gathered to watch, Jake's hands would tremble and his breathing would become shallow and rapid. It had started during the 3rd week of training. The class was learning to engage targets at 300 yards, a distance that separates amateur shooters from true marksmen. Jake had been performing well in practice, hitting 8 out of 10 shots in the center ring consistently. But when Sergeant Wilson called for his first formal evaluation, something changed inside Jake's mind. As he settled into the prone position behind his rifle, Jake could feel the eyes of his 23 classmates boring into his back. His heart began racing so fast he could hear it pounding in his ears. The rifle scope seemed to shake no matter how tightly he gripped the weapon. His first shot missed the target completely, sailing harmlessly into the dirt backstop 50 yards beyond the target. The second shot hit the outer edge of the target, barely qualifying as a hit. By the 3rd shot, sweat was dripping into his eyes. Despite the cool October morning, Sergeant Wilson had pulled Jake aside after that disastrous performance and spoke to him in the firm but caring tone that experienced instructors use with struggling students. Wilson explained that performance anxiety was common among new snipers, especially those who put tremendous pressure on themselves to succeed. He recommended extra practice sessions and breathing exercises that had helped other students overcome similar challenges. Jake threw himself into the additional training with desperate determination. He stayed on the range until 8 p.m. every evening, long after his classmates had returned to their barracks for dinner and rest. He practiced the breathing techniques Wilson had taught him, inhaling slowly for 4 counts, holding for 4 counts, then exhaling for 4 counts while squeezing the trigger during his natural respiratory pause. But the anxiety only seemed to get worse as the weeks progressed. During his second evaluation at 400 yards, Jake managed only 3 hits out of 10 attempts. His third evaluation at 500 yards resulted in just 1 successful hit. Each failure fed into the next, creating a cycle of mounting pressure and decreasing performance that seemed impossible to break. The other students began to notice Jake's struggles. Though most were kind enough not to comment directly, Tommy Rodriguez, a former Army mechanic from Texas, often stayed late to practice alongside Jake, offering quiet encouragement and technical tips about rifle maintenance and scope adjustment. Maria Santos, one of only 3 women in the program, shared her own stories about overcoming self-doubt during her time in the Air Force. But kindness from classmates couldn't change the hard reality of the program's requirements. To graduate from Fort Braxton Sniper Academy and earn the coveted sniper qualification, students needed to demonstrate consistent accuracy at distances up to 800 yards under various conditions. They had to hit targets in daylight and darkness, in wind and rain, while timed and while under simulated stress. Jake's performance had actually gotten worse as the distances increased and conditions became more challenging. The final straw came during week 7, during what instructors called the stress shoot. This evaluation was designed to simulate the pressure and chaos of actual combat conditions. Students had to engage multiple targets at varying distances, while loudspeakers played recordings of gunfire, explosions, and shouting voices. Smoke machines created a hazy atmosphere that made target identification more difficult. Most challenging of all, each student had to complete the course while other students and instructors watched and critiqued their performance in real time. Jake's performance during the stress shoot was so poor that Sergeant Wilson had to stop the evaluation halfway through for safety reasons. Jake had missed his first 6 shots completely, with one round coming dangerously close to hitting a range safety barrier that protected nearby instructors. His breathing had become so erratic that he was hyperventilating, and his hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't maintain a stable shooting position. After that disaster, Jake was called into a meeting with the Academy's commanding officer, Major Patricia Hayes. Major Hayes was a veteran sniper herself, with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for being tough but fair. She explained to Jake that while his theoretical knowledge and physical capabilities were strong, his inability to perform under pressure made him unsuitable for sniper duty. The lives of other soldiers would depend on a sniper's ability to make critical shots in the most stressful situations imaginable, and Jake had demonstrated repeatedly that stress caused his performance to collapse. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours to Jake. Major Hayes was professional and respectful, acknowledging Jake's effort and suggesting that he might find success in other military specialties, where his intelligence and dedication would be valuable assets. But Jake barely heard her words. All he could think about was calling his brother Marcus to explain that he had failed to follow in his footsteps. That evening, Jake sat alone in his barracks room, staring at a framed photograph of himself and Marcus taken during Jake's high school graduation. Marcus looked proud and confident in his dress blue Marine uniform, his sniper qualification badge gleaming on his chest. Jake remembered the promise he had made that day, swearing that he would earn his own sniper badge and serve alongside the elite marksmen who protected their fellow soldiers from impossible distances. Now that promise lay in ruins, destroyed by his own inability to control his nerves when it mattered most. Jake had always prided himself on being mentally tough, on never giving up in the face of challenges. He had pushed through difficult college courses, completed grueling physical training, and overcome homesickness during his first weeks of military service. But this challenge was different, more personal and more devastating than anything he had faced before. The next morning brought Jake's final day at the academy, though he wasn't scheduled to leave until the following dawn. Most of his classmates were preparing for their final evaluation, a comprehensive test that would determine who graduated and who would need additional training. Jake spent the morning cleaning his assigned rifle one last time and organizing his equipment for turn-in to the armory. Around 11:30 a.m., as Jake was walking across the base toward the administrative building to complete his out-processing paperwork, he heard the sharp crack of gunfire coming from the main training range. This wasn't unusual as classes practiced shooting throughout the day, but something about the pattern of shots caught Jake's attention. Instead of the steady, rhythmic firing of practice drills, he heard sporadic, urgent shooting mixed with shouting voices. Jake changed direction and jogged toward the range, his curiosity overcoming his desire to finish his paperwork and leave the base as quickly as possible. As he approached the firing line, he could see a crowd of instructors and students gathered around one of the shooting positions. Sergeant Wilson was speaking rapidly into a radio, while other instructors scanned the distant target area with binoculars. Tommy Rodriguez spotted Jake approaching and quickly filled him in on what was happening. During a routine training exercise, one of the instructors, Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy, had been operating a remote-controlled target system at the 800-yard line when the control unit malfunctioned. Instead of returning to the safety bunker as programmed, the target mechanism had gotten stuck in the open area downrange, and Murphy had gone forward to fix it manually. While Murphy was working on the target system, a mechanical failure in the range's electronic safety system had caused the overhead warning lights to malfunction. Without the red warning lights that normally indicated when someone was downrange, a training group from a different unit had begun live-fire exercises on an adjacent range. Their rounds were impacting dangerously close to Murphy's position, and the thick vegetation and rolling terrain made it impossible for anyone to approach him safely. Murphy had taken cover behind the concrete target structure, but he was effectively pinned down by the misdirected gunfire from the adjacent range. Radio communication with the other unit had failed due to different frequency settings, and the range's emergency shutdown system required someone to physically reach a control box located near Murphy's position. Jake could see the problem immediately as he studied the situation through borrowed binoculars. Staff Sergeant Murphy was trapped behind inadequate cover about 850 yards from the main firing line. The control box that would shut down the adjacent range's exercises was mounted on a post approximately 20 feet from Murphy's position, but reaching it would require exposing himself to the random gunfire that continued to impact the area every few seconds. Major Hayes had arrived on scene and was coordinating with range safety personnel to establish communication with the other training unit, but those efforts were taking precious time. Every minute that passed increased the risk that Murphy would be hit by a stray round or would make the dangerous decision to leave his cover and attempt to reach the control box himself. Jake found himself studying the tactical problem with the same analytical mindset he had applied to classroom exercises and practice scenarios. The distance to the target was 850 yards, well within the range of the rifles used at the academy. Wind conditions were relatively calm with only a slight breeze from the west. The target itself wasn't Murphy, but rather the emergency control box that would stop the adjacent range's firing exercises. The control box was a metal rectangle about the size of a paperback book, painted bright yellow for visibility. Hitting it would require a precise shot that threaded between the target structure where Murphy was taking cover and the random incoming fire from the adjacent range. It was an extremely difficult shot even under ideal conditions, made nearly impossible by the time pressure and danger to Murphy's life. Jake realized that he was unconsciously calculating wind drift and bullet drop for the shot, his mind automatically working through the mathematical formulas that had become second nature during his weeks of training. At 850 yards, a match-grade round from one of the academy's precision rifles would drop approximately 42 inches and drift about 6 inches in the current wind conditions. What struck Jake most powerfully was that he wasn't feeling the familiar surge of anxiety that had plagued every other shooting situation at the academy. Instead of focusing on his own performance or the judgment of others, his entire attention was concentrated on the problem of helping Staff Sergeant Murphy. The tactical challenge engaged his analytical mind in a way that felt natural and comfortable, like solving a complex math problem rather than performing under pressure. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Jake approached Sergeant Wilson and quietly suggested that someone attempt to disable the control box with a precision rifle shot. Wilson initially dismissed the idea, explaining that the risk of hitting Murphy or causing other damage was too great. But as Jake explained the geometry of the shot and the safety considerations he had analyzed, Wilson began to listen more carefully. Major Hayes overheard the conversation and joined the discussion, asking Jake to elaborate on his tactical assessment. Jake found himself speaking with calm confidence as he outlined the shot parameters, the safety considerations, and the alternative approaches that might work if the primary plan failed. His voice was steady and his thoughts were clear, completely different from the nervous stammering that had characterized his performance during formal evaluations. The situation was becoming more urgent as Murphy's radio reports indicated that incoming rounds were hitting closer to his position. The efforts to establish communication with the adjacent range had failed, and Murphy was running low on water in the increasingly hot afternoon sun. Major Hayes made the command decision to attempt Jake's suggested solution. The question then became which shooter would attempt the challenging shot. Several of the academy's top students volunteered, including Maria Santos and 2 others who had already passed their final evaluations with distinction. But as Major Hayes reviewed the requirements of the shot, she found herself looking at Jake with a thoughtful expression. Jake felt a familiar stirring of anxiety as he realized what Major Hayes was considering, but it was different this time. The nervous energy felt more like excitement than paralyzing fear. When Major Hayes asked if Jake felt confident attempting the shot, he surprised himself by nodding without hesitation. The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparation and equipment checks. Jake was issued one of the academy's most accurate rifles, a precision instrument capable of shooting groups smaller than 1 inch at the required distance. The rifle's scope was carefully adjusted for the specific range and conditions, and Jake was given 5 rounds of match-grade ammunition. As Jake settled into the shooting position, he was acutely aware that dozens of people were watching him, including instructors who had witnessed his previous failures and classmates who knew about his struggles with performance anxiety. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by their attention, Jake found himself drawing strength from the knowledge that Staff Sergeant Murphy was depending on him. The rifle felt familiar and comfortable in Jake's hands as he adjusted his position and began his pre-shot routine. His breathing naturally settled into the rhythm he had practiced hundreds of times during late evening training sessions. Through the scope, he could clearly see the yellow control box and the concrete structure where Murphy was taking cover. Jake's first shot was a ranging shot, intended to confirm his calculations and provide reference for adjustment if needed. He squeezed the trigger during his natural respiratory pause, and the rifle recoiled smoothly against his shoulder. Through the scope, Jake could see his bullet impact in the dirt approximately 2 feet to the left of the control box, almost exactly where his calculations had predicted given the slight breeze. Without pausing to second-guess himself, Jake made a minor adjustment to his point of aim and prepared for his second shot. This time, he held slightly into the wind and raised his point of impact by an additional inch to account for the specific ballistics of this rifle and ammunition combination. The second shot felt perfect the moment Jake squeezed the trigger. He could sense the precision of his hold, the smoothness of his trigger pull, and the stability of his shooting position. Through the scope, he watched the yellow control box disappear in a small cloud of dust and debris as his bullet struck it dead center. Immediately, the random gunfire from the adjacent range ceased as the emergency shutdown system activated. Within seconds, Murphy's voice came over the radio confirming that he was safe and beginning his return to the main firing line. The entire incident had lasted less than 45 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone involved. The immediate aftermath was a blur of congratulations, paperwork, and incident reports. Jake found himself surrounded by classmates and instructors who wanted to discuss the technical aspects of his shot and congratulate him on his performance under pressure. But Jake barely heard their words, still somewhat stunned by what had just happened. Later that evening, Major Hayes called Jake into her office for a private conversation. She began by acknowledging the obvious irony of the situation. A student who was being expelled for poor marksmanship had just made one of the most difficult shots in the Academy's recent history, under maximum pressure conditions. But Major Hayes was too experienced an officer to be swayed by a single dramatic incident. She explained to Jake that while his performance that afternoon had been remarkable, it didn't necessarily change the fundamental issues that had led to his dismissal from the program. Sniper duty required consistent performance under pressure, not just one moment of excellence followed by a return to previous struggles. However, Major Hayes also acknowledged that Jake's performance during the emergency had revealed something important about his character and capabilities. His tactical analysis had been sound, his communication under pressure had been clear and professional, and his actual shooting performance had been flawless when the stakes were highest. These were exactly the qualities that define successful snipers in combat situations. Major Hayes offered Jake an unprecedented opportunity: remain at the academy for an additional 2 weeks and attempt to repeat his afternoon's performance under controlled training conditions. If Jake could demonstrate consistent accuracy and composure during this probationary period, his expulsion would be rescinded and he would be allowed to complete the full training program. Jake accepted the offer without hesitation, but he also understood the magnitude of the challenge ahead. He would essentially have to prove that his performance during the emergency hadn't been a fluke, that he could access that same state of calm focus during routine training exercises and formal evaluations. The next morning, Jake began what felt like a completely new training experience. Instead of focusing on his anxiety and previous failures, he approached each practice session with the same problem-solving mindset that had guided him during the emergency. Rather than thinking about hitting targets to avoid failure, Jake began thinking about each shot as an opportunity to solve an interesting tactical puzzle. The change in his mental approach had an almost immediate impact on his performance. During his first practice session of the probationary period, Jake hit 8 out of 10 shots at 600 yards, his best performance at that distance since his early weeks at the academy. More importantly, he felt calm and focused throughout the session, even when Sergeant Wilson observed his shooting. Over the following days, Jake's consistency continued to improve. He began hitting targets at 700 yards with regularity, then 800 yards, then even further distances under various weather conditions. His classmates, many of whom were preparing for their final graduation exercises, began seeking his advice on technical aspects of long-range shooting. The transformation wasn't just in Jake's shooting performance, but in his entire approach to the mental challenge of precision marksmanship. He realized that his previous anxiety had stemmed from focusing too much on himself and too little on the mission. When his attention was directed toward solving tactical problems and helping others, his natural skills could emerge without interference from self-doubt. On the final day of his probationary period, Jake faced his ultimate test, a comprehensive evaluation that included all of the shooting challenges that had defeated him during his initial time at the academy. The stress shoot, multiple target engagement at varying distances, and timed precision shots under simulated combat conditions. As Jake prepared for the evaluation, he reflected on everything that had changed since that afternoon when he had saved Staff Sergeant Murphy. The most important change wasn't in his shooting technique or his understanding of ballistics, but in his understanding of his own mind and motivations. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to focus on mission and purpose even when fear was present. Jake's final evaluation lasted 3 hours and included every type of shooting challenge used in the Academy's curriculum. He engaged targets from 300 yards to 900 yards in daylight and simulated darkness with and without time pressure. His performance was virtually flawless, earning him the highest score recorded by any student in his class. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in formation with his 22 surviving classmates as Major Hayes presented them with their sniper qualification badges. Marcus had driven 18 hours to attend the graduation ceremony, and Jake could see the pride and joy in his older brother's eyes as the badge was pinned to Jake's uniform. That evening, at the graduation celebration dinner, Sergeant Wilson approached Jake with a question that had been bothering him since the emergency incident several weeks earlier. Wilson asked Jake to explain how he had managed to overcome his performance anxiety so completely and so quickly after weeks of struggle. Jake thought for a long moment before answering, wanting to give his mentor an honest and complete response. He explained that the key had been discovering the difference between performing for others and serving others. When his focus had been on avoiding failure and earning approval, the pressure had been overwhelming. But when his attention shifted to solving problems and protecting people, his natural abilities could emerge without interference. Jake's story became something of a legend at Fort Braxton Sniper Academy, told to future classes as an example of how mental approach could be more important than natural talent in determining success. But Jake himself rarely discussed the dramatic circumstances of his near expulsion and ultimate graduation. He was too busy applying the lessons he had learned to his actual military service. 6 months after graduation, Jake found himself deployed to a forward operating base in a mountainous region where his skills as a precision marksman were desperately needed. His unit's mission was to provide overwatch and protection for supply convoys traveling through dangerous territory controlled by hostile forces. On his 3rd week of deployment, Jake faced a situation remarkably similar to his final day at the academy. A supply convoy had been ambushed in a narrow valley, with several vehicles disabled and soldiers taking cover behind their trucks. The attackers were positioned on high ground approximately 1,000 yards from Jake's observation post, using the terrain to shield themselves from return fire. Jake's mission was to engage the attackers with precision fire, neutralizing the threat while avoiding any risk to the friendly forces trapped in the convoy below. It was exactly the type of high-pressure, high-stakes shooting that had once filled him with paralyzing anxiety. But as Jake settled into position behind his rifle and began analyzing the tactical situation, he felt the same calm focus that had guided him during Staff Sergeant Murphy's rescue. His breathing was steady, his hands were stable, and his mind was clear. He wasn't thinking about his own performance or the possibility of failure. His entire attention was concentrated on the mission of protecting his fellow soldiers. Jake's first shot struck the primary target at 10:47 a.m., neutralizing the threat and allowing the convoy to begin moving toward safety. Over the next 20 minutes, he engaged multiple targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, each shot precisely placed to maximum effect. By 11:15 a.m., the convoy was clear of the danger area and continuing its mission. Later that day, as Jake cleaned his rifle and prepared his after-action report, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he had packed his bags for expulsion from Sniper Academy. The young man who had nearly been dismissed for poor marksmanship had become exactly what he had always dreamed of being, a guardian angel watching over his fellow soldiers from impossible distances. The transformation hadn't been the result of discovering some hidden talent or overcoming a simple technical problem. Instead, Jake had learned one of the most important lessons any sniper could master: that true precision comes not from perfect technique, but from perfect focus on mission and purpose. When a marksman's entire attention is directed toward protecting others and solving tactical problems, his hands become steady, his breathing becomes calm, and his shots find their targets with unerring accuracy. Jake's story serves as a reminder that sometimes our greatest challenges reveal our greatest strengths, and that the path to success often leads through the valley of apparent failure. The shot that saved Staff Sergeant Murphy had been more than just a remarkable display of marksmanship under pressure. It had been the moment when Jake discovered who he truly was and what he was capable of becoming.